Welcome. Get started a little bit late, but my name is Andy White, and I'm one of the Lebanon state representatives. And I just want to, first of all, thank you for making it out tonight. I want to just preface what we're going to talk about tonight. We all have some things with just letting you know we don't intend for this to be a partisan event. However, everyone here is an elected Democrat from Lebanon. So you're going to be getting, for certain, that type of, that perspective. Although, you know, when appropriate, I think we're well prepared to offer you the counterpoints. Each of us serve in the legislature, a 400-member legislature, and each one of us is assigned to a committee. And that's where the bulk of the legislative work gets done. So we'll be offering you largely our opinion and our knowledge base from our committee work and that of the general kind of House. Anything more specific, I think we can probably pull it up and talk to you about it if you have specific questions. So we want to talk to you about some of the good stuff that's happened in Concord, because there has been some good stuff, some of the bad stuff, and then maybe some of the stuff that could be really bad or not, depending on what happens. And I think it's really important for us all to kind of remember that as we start this dialogue, especially with this budget, this kind of budget showdown looming, that we have to acknowledge that in New Hampshire there exists this structural deficit. We have a situation where businesses pay much higher taxes than individuals do. Where, welcome, Senator.
Have a seat.
Where property taxpayers, pay a pretty heavy burden in proportion to individuals here. We've got a system that's not based on people's ability to pay. So we acknowledge that kind of at the beginning, and it's a very frustrating and difficult situation for us. But when we talk about some of the challenges, we have to realize that that's the current reality that we face. So I think with that,
I came in just at the right time.
Senator, welcome.
Yeah, I apologize for being late. I had it calendared for 6:30 instead of 6, so I apologize. And then I found an email, so I apologize for being late. But so a Senate update. I mean, of course, the big thing that's been going on in the Senate recently is, as I'm sure Andy touched on, but in the House too, but is the budget. And the Senate passed a budget and then went into a committee of conference, and we're set to vote on it on Wednesday, the committee of conference report. And that's the one that the governor has said she is promised to veto if it comes out the way it came out of the committee of conference, if it stays that way. So that's been our focus in the Senate on that's taken up a lot of the discussion. I mean, the House passed their budget in March, I believe, right? But that's been dominating our calendar. We've also, as the House does, we'll be taking up some of the governor's vetoes on other bills. To me, one of the most important ones is SB 179. Now, she hasn't vetoed that yet, but Senate Bill 179 is the voting bill that would require a 30-day residency requirement prior to being allowed to vote. I was at or participated in a press conference last week at the State House to urge the governor to vote to veto it. Just the plain language of the bill, it's unconstitutional under Supreme Court precedent. Whereas in a 1972 case, I believe, where Justice Marshall was writing for the court and said that these residency requirements, that a state could not presume that someone was a non-resident merely because they hadn't lived there for 30 days. So that's the rule of law that this case produced. And the majority produced this bill in order, ostensibly, to eliminate drive-by, what they're calling drive-by voting. Someone coming into town, registering to vote, through the same-day registration system and then immediately leaving. And so they thought that a 30-day residency requirement would prevent that. Well, the court said that, court went even further actually and said that issues of fraud like that is still not enough justification to impose a 30-day residency requirement, because there's no evidence to suggest that someone who has lived there one day and intends to live, in this case, New Hampshire, for the rest of the time, is any less likely or more likely to commit fraud than someone who does drive-by voting. And I made it clear when I was talking about this bill in the Senate that if there is evidence of drive-by voting, that those people should be prosecuted, it should be stopped, that clearly someone who doesn't have the intent to remain in New Hampshire should not be allowed to vote here. But when asked about the evidence, and the ACLU brought this up in the press conference last week, the ACLU put in a right to know request to the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State is the chief election officer of the state, and asked for evidence of all instances since the year 2000 of this so-called drive-by voting. People who've registered, voted, and then couldn't be found, or was determined to be drive-by voting. And the Secretary of State could not produce one case of that. So not only is the rule that the bill seeks to impose unconstitutional, but the legislature hasn't been able to come up with any evidence that the bill is needed, which is, of course, a requisite. I'm confident, 100% certain, that if the governor, for some reason, this does become law, and the governor doesn't veto it, that it will immediately be taken to court and be struck down immediately by the courts. There's no question in my mind. But I'm also very confident that Governor Hassan, who has been always very strong on the issue of voting rights and maintaining our system of free, fair, accessible elections, that she will veto this. In which case, the bill will come back to the Senate first for the decision whether to override or sustain her veto. And there are enough of us who support voting rights that we will sustain the veto. So the bill will never become law. Thank goodness. So that's one of the big issues that I've been fighting as well, because I enjoy the election law issues and the analysis of them, and this has been a big one. So I guess that's really what we've been doing in the Senate, is the budget and the taking up the vetoes and doing committee conference reports. But the Senate, I think the budget that the Senate produced was more reasonable, if you're looking at it on a continuum, more reasonable than what the House passed, but still doesn't meet what I believe and what the governor believes are shared priorities. And I have a radio show every Monday morning, and the announcer asked me a question. He said, well, you got this millions of dollars for drug abuse, and this much for Meals on Wheels, and this much for congregate meals. He said, that sounds like a lot of money. And I said, well, you have to compare it to what current funding levels are, which this budget, even coming out of the Senate and now the Committee of Conference, cuts that. So, but more importantly, you got to measure it against what the need is. So picking a number out of the air with no relationship to what the need is not responsible budgeting. In fact, I think it was the Concord Monitor who opined, when the House still had the budget, that it was like watching a bunch of adolescents putting together a budget. I think the Senate was a bit more thoughtful than the majority in the House, but still. And for me, one of the big issues is the fact that the budget does not reauthorize Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion was a bipartisan vote that we took last year, that now almost 40,000 Granite Staters have access to health insurance. But also, it's important because in my District 5, which includes Lyme all the way down to Charlestown, in Canaan and Enfield, I have 3 hospitals, Valley Regional in Claremont, APD here in Lebanon, and also DHMC here in Lebanon. And the Hospital Association has reported that because of Medicaid expansion, uncompensated care for emergency room visits, inpatient visits, and outpatient visits have all dropped around 20%, some a little bit more than 20, some a little less than 20. But that is a huge cost savings to our hospitals, and because our hospitals, especially in this area, are some of the largest employers, that's a good thing for the economy. And the fact that the Republicans have decided not to reauthorize Medicaid expansion in the budget, I think is very irresponsible, because when it did pass, there was only 18 or so Republicans who voted to pass the law back in 2014. And we're being told in the Senate that we don't have to put it in the budget because we'll have a standalone bill in 2016 and we'll get it through then. And my question to them was, I said, I don't see a plan forward with that, because if only 18 of the who now hold the majority in the House voted for it at that time, how do you expect to get a standalone bill through the House? I think with the budget, it would be more responsible or have better chances, just because there is some leverage there. But in a standalone bill, I don't understand how they expect to get it through. So that, for me, that is the biggest issue for me coming out of the budget. But of course, there are, as I'm sure others may have already spoken to, that there are a lot of other reasons to be against this budget, and I'm sorry that it got to this point, because we've been telling them over and over and over and over again, not only about what a lot of us believe are the moral aspects of this budget, but also just doesn't make economic sense. So I don't, we only got a couple of days before both chambers vote on the community conference report, but that means that there's really is still time, hopefully, for them to do something to make it a little bit better, but I don't see any movement on their part, so I'm afraid it's going to go to a veto.
What about energy, Senator?
Okay. We had a bill that came to us from the House that would have RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, would have allocated the proceeds from the collective that the initiative created. It would have allocated the proceeds in a certain way, which would have saved. It would, on the one hand, it would have taken away a bit from residential consumers to the tune of 80 cents a month, but it would have saved municipalities and industry millions and millions of dollars. And we passed that in the Senate, which I thought was a very good thing. There are other parts of the bill that came from the House that we actually excised out of the bill and passed it with just the proceeds allocation. And then when it went to a committee of conference, the House majority, I think because of their pretty uncompromising opposition to the whole idea of climate change and regional greenhouse gas initiative, just said no deal, which was unfortunate too, because this thing really had nothing to do with global climate change or RGGI itself. It was about how the funds are being allocated, and that could have saved our businesses millions of dollars a year at the expense, albeit of $9.60 for each consumer per year. But I think that's something that we as a state could have done. And there are other energy bills. There's been a lot of focus on energy because that's what a lot of businesses are complaining about. It's not the high tax rate in New Hampshire for businesses. but the high cost of energy. And, so one of the proposals is that in another bill that we discussed is about the siting of a natural gas pipeline through the southwestern part of the state. And of course, there's a lot of, NIMBY, not in my backyard, kind of reaction to that as well. But I believe, and there's going to, I think, a lot more discussion on that as well, because, you have so many very powerful interests, the corporate interests who are trying to get the pipeline in, and a lot of the, the constituents' interests of making sure that it's sited correctly. The majority had put in provisions about eminent domain, which is the taking of land for these purposes. But the way they said it, the way they put it in the bill, it wasn't feasible, and I don't believe constitutional, actually, upon reading the bill. But I'm sure that's going to get a lot more play in 2016.
So we'll take questions at the end. If you have any questions about specific bills, things we've not talked about, kind of make sure, because each of us is going to talk about something a little bit different. And then we will make sure there's plenty of time for your questions. So Sue's going to talk to us a little bit about the budget, and one of the things that I think is the most fascinating that is not immediately available is what's called the back of the budget. And she's going to try and explain that for us, because I think that is, as a legislator, was one of the more important things for me to learn, because just because it's there doesn't really mean it's there.
Oh dear. I'm on the Ways and Means Committee, and I was an alternate on the budget this last week, which meant I barely existed this last week. And I've synthesized everything in a 2-page handout, which is in the back for those of you that didn't pick it up yet, on the budget that came out of the Committee of Conference. Basically followed the Senate model, which was considerably a lot better than the House model. The House, in fact, after it produced a very bare bones budget, was forced, in order to get it passed, to cut a lot of things further. That's where most of the elder services disappeared. That's where I believe the office consolidation that would have lost us the Department of Health and Human Services office in Claremont disappeared. A lot of things like that, the college system, the community college system, as well as the university system, were slashed again badly. The House is in the unfortunate position of having 4 groupings inside of it. 3 of them are Republican. The Democrats are pretty much united in the way we look at these things. There is a old-fashioned conservative Republican group, which pretty much the Speaker belongs to. There is the O'Brien faction, which believes that we should be able to do with a half or a quarter of the government that we've got now. And then there is a group of new people that have come in and are an interesting mix of somewhat moderate Republicans of the old style that we used to have when I first became a legislator 19 years ago, and really conservative, trying to figure out for themselves what's going on and why is it that the government isn't providing services they think are really important when there's too much money available. So I've got 2 of them on my committee. It's been really interesting. They helped get the bill through that WISE is going to benefit from, which increases the funding to domestic violence by raising the marriage fee by $5. And they managed to convince the rest of the Republicans that they had to do it. And they made me write the blurb, because they didn't want to be responsible for the $5. But they were really strong about it. And then they'll turn around and they'll vote with the others on things that cut the revenues. And it took me years to start to understand the New Hampshire budget. And so I don't blame anybody for not getting the general problem. And the general problem has been that we have lost 15% in the last 15 years of the buying power of our revenues in the state. And we probably were losing it before that, but we had a major tax change at that point, so you can't compare. And now it's being accelerated both by what Representative O'Brien got done when he was Speaker, and by what the Senate President is now doing, because he really feels that our budget should never get larger than it is now. And there really is no consideration for inflation or for growing need where there may be growing need, either by the businesses, because they really need the roads fixed, and they need something done about the energy situation, and they need something done about the universities. So we have that situation where we've been losing revenue over time. We've been reacting to it by trying to make services as efficient as possible. There comes a time when you can't really do that very well anymore. Instead, you're making them less efficient. And my personal belief is that we reached that phase in our second term in the majority 6 years ago now, I think it is, because we were cutting so much to keep with where our revenues were going during the Great Recession. And we have not recovered from it. But this budget does a lot of good things. I've listed them on the front here. For substance abuse treatment, for the elder services, for our Claremont office that our low-income people really depend on, and it's hard enough for them to get to Claremont. If they were going to have to drive to Littleton or Keene, it would have been a lot worse. And for the emergency shelters, which we're going to lose most of their funding. I understand the elder services would have ended up losing most of their funding under what the House had proposed, because the federal government requires a maintenance of effort, which means that you have to keep spending at least as much as you were spending before. And if they don't get it, then they don't give you the funding that matches. And our health and human services programs are just about all matched at least at 50% by the federal government. So every time we make a cut of $1, we get a cut of $2. The budget restored almost all of the mental health funding that we had to provide for the lawsuit that we settled last term that was caused by the prior term. Fortunately, because the lawsuit would have immediately reopened, and the Senate understood that, the House didn't, and made sure that we'd provide enough back, and gave us, when we asked for it, the flexibility in using that money that will probably allow us to meet the lawsuit conditions. And it does, in a lot of ways, help mental health in this state, which really needed help. Unfortunately, the lawyers who wrote the lawsuit are supposed to have been a little too creative in ways that the mental health professionals didn't appreciate, and some of the money is having to go for things that don't really help. but there was that. They restored enough of the community college funding so that they have promised that they will maintain tuition at current rates. But the university has promised it will deliver less than a double-digit rate of inflation. In other words, the tuition of your child can go up by 9.99% next year and the year after. That's because the university wasn't restored anywhere near as much. And they provided a large increase for charter schools. They restored the catastrophic aid, which is important for every school district because you never know when you're going to get hit by a $500,000 kid. They shifted the adequacy funding in a way that I'm pretty sure is going to hurt Lebanon, which increases our property taxes. And it will definitely hurt Claremont. But what they did, the adequacy formula at this point does not increase by inflation the amount of money that you get for having a kid that is low income, that can't speak English, that is special ed. It only increases it by inflation for the basic per pupil. So over time, the districts with needier students end up with less money. And that one, they are, as the radio keeps saying, increasing adequacy funding somewhat though, per student. But they are increasing it to the towns that have growing numbers of students because they're wealthy communities and people are trying to move into them, and not to the towns like Claremont that are and Berlin that are losing students because nobody wants to live where there's a bad school. So it's not really a good result from the original Claremont lawsuit. They restored some of the developmental disability money. They restored most of the transportation money, but there are problems with that. I don't know if George is going to talk about those some. And I've got a little bit about it in here. The state, a lot of our state workers are not being paid enough money relative to the private sector that we can replace them easily when they retire. The correction system especially has been having a really hard time getting workers that are capable of doing the job and aren't going to be slapping somebody around or something and getting us into another lawsuit, violating civil liberties. And so they need a very large overtime budget. The House slashed that. The Senate restored half of it, so they're a little iffy right now. They restored public safety enough to operate. I'm told they can probably get through without major problems. I've always felt public safety had a lot of fat in it, but maybe it doesn't now. And they also refused to give them money to replace 27 cruisers that the state troopers lost protecting icy spots and cars off the road last winter during the storms. 25 of those cruisers were run into by drivers that didn't realize that they were there stationary. And then there were 2 others that are so old that they should have been taken off the road long ago. Transportation also has that problem with its basic equipment, that their material is quite old and they haven't been given enough to replace more than a third of it at the most, the stuff that really has to go. And they increased the county share of nursing home funding by only 2% the first year and a little bit more in the second year, but that's better than what's going to be done. And the really good item, as far as I'm concerned, is not in the budget, it is in the capital budget, which is HB 25. They included $800,000, the Senate did, in new money for affordable housing lending. So, the bad stuff, Medicaid expansion, we've already heard, 40,000 people. These are extremely low-income adults, and there is no other way except the emergency room and free care for them, which hurts the hospitals. The state employee contract was negotiated, always comes into the budget late. I think this is the first time that the legislature's refused to fund it, but I'm not sure. Might have been decades ago. And that one affects our ability to get people to replace the people who are retiring in large numbers now. It may have accelerated downshifting to the towns, and I left handouts about that from NHPR. I'm not really sure what measure they were using, so I'm planning on using the only website that I have access to, and which is the Democratic Upper Valley Democrats website, to post charts when I get them, to then include things like that the Legislative Budget Office does. They're our gold standard. And they have almost certainly underfunded Medicaid. The number of people on Medicaid has been gradually going down as the Great Recession recedes. They've decided that it is going to decline a lot faster than it seems to be declining now, which means they didn't put enough money in the budget in case it doesn't decline faster. At the last minute, they handed over an extra 1.7 million so that we could get through to September on what looks like the current trend. But then after September, they'd have to be cutting somewhere. And that is the general problem with all of the good things. There are a lot of things that are on the bad side of this, which are, what are we really going to get the money they said we were going to get for this next 2 years? And also, after these next 2 years, how much money are we going to have to find that we don't have now? Because it was one-time money, or because of the business cuts they've done, because of the refusal to allow in-state auditing, and to repeal a tax change which is the only found in New Hampshire. That makes it impossible for the Department of Revenue to audit partnerships and individual proprietors if they decide to register all of their profit as income. So you can be a hedge fund manager and make $3 million a year and write down that that was how much my salary is. And you will not pay business profits tax, which is 8.5%. You will pay employment tax, which is business enterprise tax, which is 0.75%. And that's been blowing quite a hole in the first year after they passed that. There was $1 billion more money registered as salaries under that provision than there had been in the prior year, and that was during the recession. So, and every year that one gets bigger because more people think, gee, I'm a sucker if I don't do what everybody else is doing. So, then there was a bunch of raids that I've got in that handout on dedicated funds. there were overestimated lapses. The departments have to give back a certain percentage of their money at the end of every year, or every 2 years, depending, to the budget that helps pay for the next part of it, because you didn't need everything that you were given. Well, the legislature has been busy telling the governor that she has to use some of the money in health, and especially in Health and Human Services, for the healthcare providers, for this, for that, and those were supposed to go into the lapses. They're not going into the lapses, so the money will not be there. So the surplus that they anticipated and put into the budget is not going to be anywhere near as big as they said. Because to tell an agency today that by the end of this month you have to come up with 3% of your operating revenue when you've been saving these other things to pay for it, does not work. So, and then we had about 80 million in one-time or last-time money. We're doing a tax amnesty for the first time in 15 years. There are various other things that they've got or double counted on, and all of that, plus the tax cuts, those revenues are all going to have to be made up the next time we do a budget. Well over 100 million on that, aside from all of the other things that we always run into. And then finally, outside the budget again, at the last minute, we had this innocent little cigar bill, which I had been working on with my committee for 3 years, which I'm not going to go into, but which the Senate decided to use to amend to create a tax exemption for Planet Fitness, which you've read about in the paper. And there was, Planet Fitness threatened that they would leave the state if they don't get that right now, because they want to go, they've been a partnership, an LLC. They want to become a corporation and go on the stock market and do an IPO. And raise a lot of money, use some of it to pay themselves for the work they've been doing for quite a while for less money, and use another part of it to expand the business. Because they have personal income taxes in other states, they do not do what we do. Our business profits tax, which is like a corporate income tax, includes capital gains. And they would have had to pay the capital gains on that IPO. And they did not want to do that. And unless the governor vetoes it, they won't have to do that. But, and it also creates an interesting incentive for them to take the money and then leave the state. Anyway, because that way when they go to another state, they can get better tax treatment. Our laws are very different from other states because we have this very weird tax system, because we're trying to avoid both a sales and an income tax. And doing things that other states do gets us into real trouble quite frequently with our Constitution, with the rest of our tax structure. So the takeaway from the budget essentially is that there's nowhere near as much money in it as they say there is, which means that if it passes, the governor will be responsible for figuring out where to cut. And I don't know whether she'd do what they did in the House, or she'd find some other stuff to cut, but there's really nothing left to cut that doesn't severely affect businesses and individuals. And so all of it causes pain, and that's just where we are these days. And I hope that didn't take too long. But
Okay, so I just wanted to just kind of make sure, Sue talked a little bit about it, but but not in specific terms about the back of the budget. And the one thing that's really interesting about the way we do business in New Hampshire is we'll actually assign money to a line item in the budget. For example, mental health. And I'll just pull a number, $1 million. And they'll put that in the budget. And somewhere there will be revenue to pay for it. But then in the end, in the trailer bill, House Bill 2, they will require the Commissioner of Health and Human Services, for example, to cut his overall budget by $1 million. So essentially, they give it in the front, and then they take it away somewhere else. But anybody who was looking at the budget would be like, oh, there's $1 million. But in reality, the Commissioner doesn't have that $1 million because he's got to make that cut to that program or to somewhere else. So it's really a budget gimmick that has bothered me since I learned that it kind of existed.
Yeah, it's called back of the budget because the budget is about 1,000 pages. Somewhere around page 980, you get to clauses in it that say, take $1 million off of the amount that we gave you. So they usually put them in there, but sometimes they put them in HB2. And I haven't really quite figured out the rationale for that, except it's much easier to find it in HB2, even though HB2 is about, how long is it this year? About 120, 30 pages. It's easier to find it there than it is on page 980.
So I thought that was interesting, and while it may be nice to see that something's funded or we think it's funded, it in fact may not be. So I was just going to talk really briefly, and I'll, noting the time, I'll keep my comments really brief. My area of interest since I joined the legislature really was about working people, families, and how workers, businesses coexist, and how we keep workers and families healthy by healthy workplaces and that kind of thing. And that's really been my focus. And this year we had several bills. The first one is kind of this recurring so-called right to work bill. It's anything but that. It's just a really destructive scheme that's used in places largely that are economically depressed. It's used to elevate business. Really, it's used to elevate business returns, business profits at the expense of the worker by, impairing their abilities to organize and to collectively bargain. It was defeated in the Senate, thank goodness, passed the House by 3 or 4 votes due to the majority that exists, but never made it out of the Senate to the governor. So that's a really good thing for New Hampshire. Helps keep us strong. The other thing that we've been working a lot on in the Senate, more than the House perhaps, but is workers' compensation. Workers' compensation, of course, provides injured workers or sick workers with not only medical care, but up to 60% or 60% of their wages if they are unable to work. And there's been this desire this term to tinker with workers' comp by capping or fixing the amount of money that providers can collect for work-related injuries. And of course, our colleagues on the other side are completely anti-price fixing, anti-government price fixing, unless it comes to workers' comp, and then it seems that it's somehow okay. We were able to defeat that. We did change the law, which right now requires the insurer or the employer to pay the 100% of the charges. We did change that to pay the reasonable value of charges, which now we've also shifted the burden to the healthcare provider at their request, actually, because they know there's some outliers in their industry, to negotiate this and for the providers to take that role to prove that it was really necessary to charge $6,000 for the MRI that 3 miles down the road costs $3,000. So we think that's going to be a really positive step forward. We know there's going to be a pretty quick return in terms of business savings on their workers' comp rates. And we think it's also really good still for injured workers. They're going to be able to get the care they need and get back to work. There's a lot about workers' comp that I'd love to say. New Hampshire has high workers' comp rates, but we also have some of the lowest out of lost time injuries in the nation. I think we're 4th lowest. So our workers get back, our costs are high, our medical costs are high, but we put these injured workers back to work quickly. And I think we do it by providing exceptional medical care and getting them back to work with the follow-up and the support that they need. So I think we've done a great job. I just want to talk a little bit about the disappointment in Medicaid expansion. For me, I think that that's one of the things that working families, especially the working poor families, is incredibly important. The threshold is super low. This really affects people like servers in the restaurant, the service industry. And it is an incredibly valuable asset to right now 39,000 plus New Hampshire, 39, 40,000 people who are benefiting from this program. It lowers the overall cost of healthcare. Our hospitals aren't providing uncompensated care. And more importantly, these people are getting preventative care and being seen before they're really sick when it costs a lot of money. And so I'm absolutely stand with the governor making that a really high priority to make sure that expanded Medicaid gets reauthorized. I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing I just want to talk a little bit about is about businesses and how important businesses and workers are in terms of our pushing our economy and growing it. And part of the equation that I think sometimes our friends tend to miss is that New Hampshire businesses aren't complaining as much about high costs of workers' comp or high business taxes as much as they're complaining about the lack of the workforce that they really need to do the job, that is the education, which is why our community colleges are so important, and the high cost of energy. I think those are really the two things that we hear from our local businesses that are super important to them in terms of the ability to keep people working and to grow their businesses. So those, we're always looking for ways, I'm always looking for ways to help do that at the same time that we're not making our workers pay the brunt of that. So those are the things that I wanted to mention in brief. I'm happy to answer questions later on, but we'll move down to Rich, who's going to talk a little bit about the Commerce Committee and his first year as a legislator.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Richard Abel. I'm the newest of the state representatives here in Lebanon, and I serve on the Commerce and Consumer Affairs Committee. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that particular committee does. I think it's valuable because, as Andy mentioned earlier, most of the work of the state legislature takes place in committees. New Hampshire is fairly unique among states in that every single bill that is proposed gets a full hearing by a committee. In almost all other states, the chair of the committee can kill a bill because he or she doesn't like it. We look at everything. I also, because I am new, because this is my 7th month as a representative, as a state representative, I just wanted to sort of share some of my impressions as well as tell you about the things the committee does. So in any case, the Commerce and Consumer Affairs Committee has, as you would expect, duties that deal with commerce and business, and also consumer affairs. One of the impressions that has proven to be true that I've seen is that while most members of the committee, particularly in the majority, understand that they're dealing with commerce, many of them forget that they're also dealing with consumer affairs. I think it's really important to remember that we're here to promote economic development and to deal with the conditions that allow for a prosperous society, but we shouldn't forget that we're also dealing with lots and lots of consumers who also need to make sure that they're being fairly protected. The consumer, I'm so turned around, I'm calling it the Consumer Affairs Committee, which tells you probably largely what my orientation is. The Commerce and Consumer Affairs Committee passed some really good legislation this year. And most of it was not the kind of thing that made headlines, but was really good and practical and pragmatic, and it did really good things to help the prosperity of our state. We revised a lot of state statutes. For example, the laws that deal with banking, with credit unions and trust laws, with condominiums and real estate transactions, adopting a uniform securities legislation, and also dealing with lending statutes. What we did was what made a lot of sense. Laws are passed at different times and they're worded differently. So in 1920, a bill was passed that dealt with something to do with banking. And then something else in 1940, and something in 1980, and something in 2005. The problem was that they're not all in one place so that you can easily look them up, but they're all over. They're in different parts of all these, all these law books, statute books. Well, lawyers were having lots of trouble figuring it out because it took them hours to to find all the different things and where they were when they pertained to the same subject. So you can imagine if the attorneys were having trouble figuring out what was going on, how much harder it was for businesses to figure out what regulations affected them, and for the average person. So we spent a lot of time on working with bills to put everything that deals with banking laws or real estate or something in one place, and to have the same format and so forth. So that was really the good news. I think what we were able to pass makes it easier to find out things about the laws and regulations and to be able to follow them correctly. That's the good news. The bad news is that in some cases, what I saw was a kind of sneakiness in how things were handled. I'll give you an example. In terms of the bill that deals with securities, selling of securities, the bill, which was more than 100 pages, I believe, was revised. The day that our committee was going to vote on it, we were handed a revision, an amendment rather, of that bill. And the person who gave us the amendment, the member of our committee, said that it was that all they had done was they had fixed a few grammatical mistakes, they had fixed the punctuation, and so forth. And of course, we had 10 minutes to discuss a bill of 103 pages, and we were supposed to vote on it. And nobody had seen it before then. So we quickly thereafter discovered that what had been done to the bill was that there were certain registration fees that a business has to pay in order to register, to be in business and so forth. Every single one of them had been dropped out. So the net effect was, we were facing a situation where we're desperate to be able to fill basic needs and have enough revenue to do so. We were going to lose about $2 million from this. We caught it, fortunately, in time, and were able ultimately to fix it through the Committee on Conference between the House and the Senate. I guess my point for bringing this up is it really bothers me as a citizen of this state, let alone a member of the legislature, that someone would stoop to that kind of trickiness. And I know it's politics and you're supposed to expect this stuff, but what does it say about people who do those kinds of things? Who, there was no hearing about this. Nobody on the committee knew what had happened, and I found that rather distasteful. But it happens, unfortunately, too often. There are a lot of things that we do that I think that are really good, but there are also some things that I think would be really good for the public, that almost everyone in the state any reasonable person would approve of, that we cannot get the majority in our committee or in the House itself, and probably this is true in the Senate as well, to pass. And I just want to give you a couple of examples, and you can kind of come up with your own impressions and see what this tells you about the relationship of the majority in the legislature and the minority. I mentioned earlier that we passed a bill, the governor signed it, that regulates small title loans, payday loans, non-bank loans, okay? We were able to get all that legislation in one place so it was clear and all followed the same format. That was good. What wasn't good, we were completely unable to get any traction on getting rid of absolutely predatory, exorbitant interest rate title loans and things like that. We brought that up. The majority was unwilling to deal with those kinds of things. That's something we need to deal with in the next session. We were able to pass a law that gives better notice about foreclosures to banks and to lenders and so forth. Again, that's good. But what we could not get passed was a bill that deals with the rights of tenants when the landlord is foreclosed upon. The landlord doesn't pay the bank, and we wanted to pass a consumer bill that allowed those people a longer time period before they were kicked out of their apartment. They'd been paying their rent all along. We couldn't get anywhere, okay? Majority was not interested in doing that. We passed a bill that allows an employer, if the employer wishes, to give preferences in hiring to veterans, similar to what the federal government does. I think that was a positive thing, but we were unable to pass legislation, pass a bill that prevents unfair trade practices dealing with veterans when veterans are targeted by people and are charged fees for doing things like putting in applications that they could do for free. They're predatory, they're tricking people. Again, the majority was unwilling to see that as a priority. That surprised me. That really surprised me. Some other things that we were unable to do that also, I think, illustrate sort of the difference between the majority and the minority. You may not know, but the Commerce Committee heard a bill that was intended to establish the federal facilitated health exchange we have and make that the New Hampshire official exchange. We were just going to say the exchange we have now that's handled by the federal government, we'll make that our official state exchange, so that if the Supreme Court decides that people here can no longer get subsidies for that, we aren't, or there are other problems, we'll say, well, that's our official exchange. Got nowhere. The majority just didn't want to deal with it. Didn't think it was important. Thought that the Obamacare was a bad idea in the first place, and why should we do this? We also heard a bill that was to study the idea of a single-payer healthcare program in New Hampshire, whether whether it could be established. It wasn't to establish it; it was just to study it. Same thing. Minority all voted on party lines for it. The majority all voted on party lines against it. There was a bill that I spoke on in the House floor about requiring child-resistant packaging on bottles of liquid nicotine that are highly toxic to children. And there have been children in other states who have died from this. We've had lots of children. It's very, very concentrated. It's in fruit flavors, and it's easy for a kid to open and drink. And it was the kind of thing that I mentioned to my daughter, and she said, "Who could be against that?" And I thought, yeah, who could be against that? Well, we got 3 Republican votes on the House floor. 3. All the rest voted against that. So there are others. I'll try to be a little quicker here. There was a consumer bill to make spoofing illegal. I didn't know what spoofing was. Spoofing is when somebody programs something so that if you have caller ID, it tells you that the Grafton County Sheriff's Department is calling you, or the FBI is calling you, or something like that. And under the consumer protection law in New Hampshire, that's not specifically covered. So we wanted to help people from getting swindled by doing that. We got nowhere on that. I guess just by these illustrations, and there were many more, it was an eye-opener for me, because I understand the difference in political points of view and ideology and so forth, but I didn't think people would either be voting in the legislature, would be voting on their self-interest or totally by ideology. Oh yes, I want to mention one last bill, and that is there was a bill that same thing happened. It did not go forward. That was designed to prohibit. Well, it was to require, rather. It was to require people who buy gold, silver, jewelry, and so forth, but are located out of state. If they came into New Hampshire and they wanted to, show up at the motel and say, "We'll buy stuff today," that they had to register with. They had to be registered with the state of New Hampshire, and the police forces were all in favor of this because they come into Lebanon right on the border, and they're here today, and they buy a bunch of stuff. They're gone, and by the time the police even know that something was stolen from somebody, these people are gone, and we don't even know where they are. Isn't that a reasonable Consumer Protection Act? Shouldn't we pass that? Well, we were unable to get any traction with it. So I guess that's really what I think, in microcosm, I think these things show some of the differences in what the priorities are between members of the majority right now and the minority in terms of what they think is important. And sometimes my jaw drops when I think about things that they just don't think are worth passing or considering. Thank you.
Just in case you're wondering, in terms of, oh my goodness, Rich was talking about a lot of bills. This session, in January, there were nearly 800 bills introduced in the New Hampshire legislature. So that's a huge number. And the Commerce and Consumer Affairs Committee is one of the busier committees on the House side, and I don't know the exact number, but they
Well,
certainly took,
we were, I think we had 94 of those 800 bills, so.
which is pretty heavy because labor had about 24. So George is going to fill us in a little bit on labor and a little bit of information about how some of the state budget decisions affect the county specifically, which is important.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I wanted to just talk about. To begin with, so I'm George Sykes, and I serve on the Transportation Committee. And what a lot of people don't know is that the Transportation Committee does driver laws, we do bus regulations, Department of Motor Vehicle regulations, we do planes, and we do trains, and trucking regulations that aren't federal. We don't do bridges and we don't do highways. Bridges and highways are carried by the Public Works Committee. So I was asked, I don't serve on that committee, so Sue has done a pretty decent job of giving you the very briefest thumbnail of what's happening. The only thing I would reemphasize is that, to begin with, the Department of Transportation's highway and bridges, their budget was already under tremendous strain. They didn't particularly cut it, but they certainly didn't put any money back in. So we'll continue to be behind the 8 ball in terms of trying to maintain roads and bridges. We have an inordinate number, I think it's, well, anyway, I'll just leave it at an inordinate number of bridges and roads that just a sorry need for transportation, for upgrading and repairs. One of the things that they did affect is that they cut the amount of money that would be available to buy new equipment. And they are literally parking equipment because they don't have the money to buy new equipment to replace it. And, you know, at some point, it's just becoming crazy. So those two things about the transportation, the Public Works. Transportation Committee, one of the things that I like to tell people about, again, is that we do trains and planes and so on. Unfortunately, fortunately, I'm a big proponent of trains. I believe that commuter rail is the most cost-effective way to move people per passenger mile cost. It's relatively inexpensive to build in the first place, even with all the work that has to be done. And it's good for the environment. So there are all these reasons why we should be making investments in, it's good for public jobs, public work jobs that will create a vibrant economy. All these things are really important to do. There was a great study that they took a couple of years to do to study whether commuter rail would be cost effective and efficient for coming from Massachusetts up to Nashua, up to Manchester. The Business and Industry Association was in favor of a study for this. So all kinds of groups really want to see this happen. For the first time, they actually put what I would consider real money behind looking at the next phase of getting commuter rail going, $4 million. I know that's not really a lot of money, but it seems to, when you can't find pennies, it seems sometimes. And that has been taken out of the budget. And very disappointed to hear that. On the positive side, the Commuter Rail Transit Authority, which is established by the legislature, did have 28 members of the board of directors, and that's a pretty unwieldy number. So with a lot of angst, we were able to pare that down to 9 members as opposed to 28. The initial bill that came to us had 7. We wanted to put 2 in, and so my counterparts on the Transportation Committee tried to take the member of the public and a member well-versed in labor off the board. We had a pretty intense fight about it, if you will, but we managed to get them back in, and the bill was passed. So I felt good that we were moving in the right direction organizationally to try and make commuter rail happen in the state. A lot of people think there is no commuter rail in New Hampshire, and yet passenger rail, there's over 250,000 New Hampshire residents get on a train and get off the train just in New Hampshire annually. And a lot of people don't even realize that. So we can see those kinds of positive nature about trains. So anyways, that's my spiel about trains. The other thing that the Transportation Committee dealt with is I'm pleased to say that last term, with bipartisan support, we passed a distracted driving bill. Now, this is a big deal to have no cell phone texting, etc. In a state that has a no helmet law and no seatbelt law. This was a really big deal. So it got passed last session. There was an attempt to repeal it even before it goes into effect, which is on July 1st. I'm pleased to say the Transportation Committee was able to kill that bill in committee, and we will have that law going into effect on July 1st, which is a few days from now, so be ready. So I'm pretty happy about that. We also, one final thing, that Transportation Committee deals with license plate issues. I know it's not a big deal to most people, but we're always having to say no to license plates because they cost so much money and everybody wants one. We are going to have a study committee for the first time to look at a overarching and substantive solution to the problem once and for all. That committee will be working through the summer to try and make that happen. I'll keep you informed about that. We'll see. It's never happened yet. It may not happen this year either, but we're in hopes. Andy alluded to county government, and so I'll wrap things up. So one of the things that I do is I'm chair of Grafton County delegation. Now, those of you who are not familiar with the way government works here in New Hampshire to any great detail, all the state representatives, all 27 in Grafton County, they serve as the Grafton County delegation. And that delegation passes the budget for county government. So one of the things that you should be aware of that is a concern is that not only did we have dollars from this budget downshifting cost to the city of Lebanon to the tune of, was it 1.2 million?
1.24.
1.24 million. Just on one item alone, there's only one particularly significant cost shifting to county government to the tune of $186,000 that will cost us in more dollars to keep the nursing homes operating, because the state is not going to fund that amount of money as it currently stands now. Now, $186,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but in a small, relatively speaking, small county government budget, that was significant. The good news, we were able to replace that money, and the increase in the county budget will be, for Lebanon, will be only about $50,000. So over a $1.9 billion tax base to find $32,000, $56,000 isn't too bad. So that's, in the interest of time, I'm gonna stop.
All right, so just before we go on, I'll just let everybody know that while George did not author the original distracted driver bill last term that passed, the one that's going to take effect, he was the one that wrote the amendment and did all the negotiating on the House and the Senate with both Republicans and Democrats to get that bill passed. So he was the one largely responsible for all of the efforts, and I actually think it's quite commendable. So.
And when I
She
get
doesn't say
ticketed,
And Sue is hoping she does not get the first ticket.
I would just like to add, however, also that the Grafton County budget is about half of the Sullivan County budget per capita.
Yeah.
And we are the third lowest spending county in the state. The other two on top of us are Rockingham and Hillsborough, which are super counties with huge population densities that give them economies of scale. And
Yeah, so I feel pretty positive about the where we are in terms of the county budget. There was a motion made during budget workshop time to try and increase by percentage the dollars that would go to social service agencies. They are always, seems to be last in line for any money that might be available, and unfortunately that motion did not pass out of the executive committee, but we'll keep trying. We'll keep trying.
Okay, so what we'd like to do with the remaining 25 or so minutes we've got before the library closes is answer questions that you have, the things that are important to you. If we're not sure, we certainly can find the information for you. But most of the subject matter, I think we could probably come up with at least the reason for you. So we'll open the floor to you all with any questions that you might have for us.
Well, I have a few. One thing I was wondering, when you're talking about Planet Fitness, I was reading about this also, you explained it better than what the paper did. What will it cost us if they were to leave the state?
As I understand it, the corporate headquarters had less than 100 employees. And they had reported into the Senate committee, it was higher than like 200 and something. But
500.
Yeah, was it 500?
They said 500, and then they changed their mind when someone found the filing.
The
that said they
filing.
were between 50 and 99.
Because you have to check a box on the corporate filing as to how many employees you have. And they check the box of the range of 50 to 99 employees, actually.
So how much would it cost us if they left compared to what we will have to be paying when other businesses follow suit with what they're threatening? Is there any comparison or
Well,
anything like that?
If we never do anything about this, and I am hoping that we are going to have to do what my Republican chair wanted to do and what my whole committee wanted to do, which was to put a bill in next year and do a proper study of this. But so we will probably be doing that because I think, pretty sure the governor is going to veto this. This bill puts a larger hole in our business tax revenues than
Just one.
anything except the burden of proof, which is the law change I was talking about earlier. And perhaps larger because it applies to corporations now as well.
Specific dollars, though? So
Yeah.
So everybody-
Yeah, it doesn't
I-
sound like it's.
what it- Essentially, it is not going to cost us the franchises because they will leave those there because they want the business. And it may not even cost us jobs because someone was pointing out they were talking of going across the border to Maine. And if they did that, the people that they had hired that live in New Hampshire would commute.
Call it a bluff.
Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta call it a
But
bluff.
the trouble is, one of the board members of Planet Fitness, and apparently the instigator of this, is ex-Governor Benson.
Oh, well.
For all of you who were here 10 years
Why are
ago.
we not surprised, right?
The first governor in 100 years not to win a second term when he wanted one.
I think the most dangerous part of that bill is not necessarily the revenue we're going to lose, which of course is important, but it's the idea that if you have enough money, if you have enough political influence, you can come in, threaten the legislature, and the legislature will just, bow down and do whatever you want.
All the more reason not to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone here probably, voted against that because that's a real danger, that the state would bow to that kind of political pressure, because this bill came in, I think it was printed, or this amendment came in, is printed at 11 o'clock on a certain morning, and they had to vote on it by 2 o'clock, the Senate Budget Committee, where it was first introduced. Governor Benson, ex-Governor Benson did come in to testify, as well as a couple of securities lawyers, I believe. But because there was no notice that this was gonna come up. The public had no idea it was coming. And so it was really done under cover of darkness, I think. But I said, again, I think the real danger here is threatening the state government with something and expecting the state government to bow down, which it did.
Well, it just doesn't seem cost effective in any way, but that's the main point that I was getting at, why.
There,
do we
there
care
is
that
a
they want to
need
do
for
this?
this, however, now, because this argument went across the country, the startups in other parts of the country noticed that we have a capital gains tax on businesses. And that if they start up in New Hampshire, someday, in order to turn themselves into a corporation and go on the stock market, they're going to have to pay a capital gains tax on that. And it has apparently reduced our national ratings for startups, which is something we care about. But the trouble is, it's a very complex area. It's hitting all different kinds of businesses and all different kinds of tax considerations and the constitutional considerations. And we have almost certainly got it wrong. There will be other businesses coming in and saying, you gave it to all of them, you didn't give it to me, that's a violation of the Constitution. There may be some people suing the way Benson did when we ended up, 30 years ago, when we ended up with business enterprise tax. It was because of his lawsuit. But what I took away from this as the biggest danger is one that I experienced myself, which is that when you pass a tax without public hearings in both chambers and give people a chance to notice it and come in and tell you what's wrong with it, which is what we had to do with the LLC tax, which people may remember back in the beginning of the recession when we had to have money. The governor came up with that, which had been sitting on the shelf in the Revenue Department as an answer. And there was a huge problem with that tax for all small businesses, a very realistically huge problem. And we had to repeal it within 6 months. And I and my vice chair spent the next year working through the problem, which affected other things in our tax law too that we'd never noticed because it was small businesses, not the big businesses. The big businesses have lobbyists. And the whole time we were fighting against an impression that we were trying to bring back the LLC tax while we were doing that, which we knew we couldn't do because there was such toxicity around that. So we have a very cobbled together tax system, and any change can be a problem, and we really need to go through public hearings. And that one, it went through, the amendment did not go through a public hearing, but after they passed it on the floor, the Senate committee held 2 information work sessions on the bill, trying to figure out how to amend it so that it would work better.
After it
And-
already passed.
And they could not refer to the bill because they were because they'd already passed it on the floor, so it didn't belong to them anymore. And so they called it something very vague that nobody who wasn't in the know would know what they were going to be talking about. But they did invite in some really good accountants who all told them, please don't do this right now. Spend time working on it. And the top tax attorney in the state, who said the same thing, but then hedged a little bit in an email that they waved around the next time. At least I didn't see the email, but that's what they said it said. They went ahead and wrote the amendment anyway. That turned it from being something just for Planet Fitness, which is totally unconstitutional in our state, to something that was not just partnerships, but also corporations, which is more constitutional, but a lot more dangerous.
Okay, what else, Carol?
I just wanted to express our appreciation to all of you for being willing to serve in this clearly frustrating environment. Thank you all from the rest of us. But I have a question. Susan, you referred in your remarks to something having to do with a refusal to do in-state auditing, and I'm not sure I understood what you were telling us. Could you clarify that for me?
Well, there was a proposal, the House actually, in this one case, they listened to the Department of Revenue Administration. The commissioner there is incredibly good, and he's earned the trust of everybody. And he came to the House and he said, I know you're struggling with these very low revenue estimates that you've got since you insisted on doing them in January. And I can bring you in more money if we can audit more. Their staff was cut by 47% in the O'Brien term, and they got back part of it, but by nowhere near as much as they needed, and particularly what they need is auditors. The Senate did, and the House listened to him, and they put in 5 auditors. 2 of them are multi-state, very high-level auditors. It's going to take them a while to get trained. 3 of them were for in-state work. The Senate removed the in-state ones, left the out-of-state ones. Another part of this auditing thing is the refusal to consider going back on the burden of proof. And what that is that in New Hampshire, if you submit a tax return that looks weird, the Department of Revenue Administration cannot ask you to provide records about that subject unless they can prove reasonable doubt to a judge. And that's, the state of Oregon tried that about 15 years ago for 3 months. Then they repealed it. Nobody else has ever tried it. And we've had it now for 3 years. And what that means is you can write down anything you want. And the biggest part of it is this problem that we were having with the LLC tax, which is that without an income tax, we need people to volunteer to tell us how much their compensation is as a worker in their business, even if they're the only person in their business. And that is a very vague concept. We did the best we could to make it less vague, and then we exempted everybody who was earning less than, now it's $75,000 a year, so that you kind of get $75,000 at the beginning, no matter how much you're making. But it was because people, the guy that mows your lawn doesn't keep records very well usually. And so he doesn't have anything to give. And frankly, there had been some very aggressive auditing going on before several commissioners ago. And they had been going after small people. I am quite sure they were going after small people because I have 2 friends who are accountants who take care of small people and who told me about cases. And the top tax auditor, a tax attorney in the state, told me about the big people they went after in the same way. So it's a very vague part of our law. We can't do anything about it unless we pass an income tax, in which case we won't need it. We can get rid of it. But it's something that if you don't provide any records for, hey, I was working at this job for 60 hours a week, and I'm a top flight physicist, and this is a physics company, and all the rest of that, then there's no way that they can tell you, you took the entire profit for your salary. And that's not allowed. So people, there's something called moral hazard, which I found some people don't know what it is, but essentially today, a few people, actually today quite a lot of people know about it because the accountants are all telling their clients about it. They're talking about it in accountants meetings. They're talking about it in tax attorney meetings. The people I know who are those things come back and say they're telling each other how to do it. But first you get the guys who really like to cheat that do it, and then you get more people, oh, there are a lot of other people doing it, I gotta do it too. And then you get the people who are really honest and think this is a bad idea, but do it anyway because all of their competitors are doing it, and they can't afford not to do it. So we're kind of halfway through that process at this point. I'm not sure where we end up.
Okay. Can I answer your question? What else? Sure.
There's a few comments on what was said. First, Richard, I'm surprised you're surprised. I would like to see, I think your list is great though, and I would like to see you maybe write an op-ed piece for some of the major papers in the state so that people can see this list and know who they may want to vote for or not. If you don't feel comfortable doing it, send it to me and I'll write it. George, thank you for all your work on the hands-free bill. Having been almost run down a couple of times in the crosswalk going to the green, I really appreciate that. Yeah, by people texting. So the other thing I wanted to say about jobs and something to generate jobs is why don't we push for energy efficiency retrofits? I mean, there's huge money in that, and it helps us conserve energy so that, you know, we might not need that natural gas pipeline. You know, I had there was a man who had been advocating that if we just, you know, made all of our buildings and homes more energy efficient, we could cut our carbon emissions by 50%. I mean, it's huge. So, I mean, that's a job creator, it's a revenue generator for the state, it's good for the environment, it's a win-win-win all ways around. And I would like to see us do that, and plus do more whatever we can to bring in more renewable energy and forego the pipeline. Because even though it may sound good to have this fracked natural gas come in, I mean, I moved here 2.5 years ago from Ohio to get away from fracking, and it does hurt people that are in those areas that are being poisoned by this process. And just keep that in mind. What may be cheap gas to you is causing medical bills for somebody else. So.
I would just say that just recently there was a solarized Lebanon, New Hampshire event, which was very well attended. I mean, there were 600 people maybe would be a guess that I would say.
Wow.
Who attended. Part of that program is there's a certain fee for the installation. Then there is a federal cost back. You get money back from the feds, but you also get money back from the state. And I may be mistaken, but I think part of the machinations around all these funds that the state is doing, it's likely that that subsidy from the state, that money that you'll get back towards the cost, is going to be going down again. And that's just the wrong way to go about this, because we could have a lot more solar energy panels installed in our city. People would be putting electricity back into the grid at certain times and taking back. And because the one good thing is we do have parity, that's not the right term, but if you generate 1 kilowatt and send it, they have to send back 1 kilowatt. And that's even though you may use it at a totally different time and at a different rate of demand. But so that's a really good thing. But the money that's going away to help pay this, so that's going to go down. And the obvious impact of that is that there'll be fewer systems installed, because the payback, instead of being 6 or 8 years, will now go to 9 or 10 or 12 years, and it just means people won't put them in.
I'm doing it anyway.
That, and that in terms of the budget discussion, which is really important to follow up on. I mean, that was one of the so-called the raids on dedicated funds. The House, I believe, depleted all but
They took
pennies
they took all of it.
of that
Oh.
fund, and the Senate, I think, only took about 50%, if my
No,
memory.
they only took 2.2 million, actually.
So the Senate was a much less, but those are the incentives, I think, that help people to be able to make that commitment to a pretty good investment, at least initially.
But they,
But you're right.
The other
They-
being funded by fossil fuels, so they don't want to do anything that would help renewable energy and cut into that money coming into their campaign contributions. So I think we all know that.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to say that the Senate also stopped the repeal of the renewable energy standards, which was very nice. And that the Reggie bill that they were fighting over, the House had totally destroyed the funding for subsidization of renewable energies, but the Senate got most of that back.
So it is on some of our radar screens.
It
We're doing the
totally
best
And
we
it
can.
does, it's one of the best things that we can do to reduce the cost of energy in the state, too.
Right.
It's my understanding, I only got this from the newspaper, so I'm checking with you, but the fact that the Republicans in the Senate and the House could not agree on the Reggie funds meant that it all went out the window and we're left with what we used to have,
Right.
which means that there's no money taken out. So we were looking at losing 52 million, and now because they couldn't agree on how to cut up the pieces, we actually, for this
Well,
particular,
they put
budget.
in the budget that they were taking 2.5 million out. That was to replace money that the House, interestingly enough, was putting a huge assessment on insurance and on the Public Utilities Commission, which would have put it on all of the energy companies and everybody else, so that their rates would have gone up some. And it was for the emergency management system which is basically for the nuclear plants if they exploded on us, but is also used, I believe George knows a lot about this, for different kinds of emergency planning as well. And we had to keep that in place because we still have Seabrook, even if Vermont Yankee is closed, but not closed quite enough, maybe to not think about emergency management. And so the House did it by these assessments, which the Senate then rejected, and they looked around and they took part of the renewable energy fund for it.
just while we're on that subject and to build on the comment back here, Tesla has now come up with this battery storage technology, which means that we now have more than double the electrical capacity, generating capacity than we need in this state. And we have more than, all we need is 46% of what we actually have going. In terms of distribution, also, it's less than 50% of what we need. So this whole push about, we've got to get all this LNG in, we really, because we don't have to worry about peak demand anymore. You can get the electricity and you can store it. You don't have to have all these other facilities. So we really need to catch up with the technology before we get into
Is that
that.
in the
And what's happening down at Price Chopper with Tesla? Anybody notice?
No,
What?
what?
I'm not sure what it is. It looks like it's car charging
charging. It
stations
is.
for
yeah.
Tesla. There's about 6 or 7 of them. Yeah. We're gonna get there.
Okay, so being 10 minutes to 8, I think that each of us, if we can, take maybe a couple of sentences, kind of sum up maybe the evening, unless there's any other burning questions, and we certainly can walk outside together. We want to make sure the library can close on time. So we'll start with you, Senator Pierce.
Well, thank you for coming out. And for watching on television as well, because it's only when the citizens engage that you can hold the government accountable. And there's a lot to hold accountable for this legislature. Everyone here on this panel is going to be fighting the budget as it's coming out, and I believe supporting the governor in her veto of the budget, because even though, as the way Sue described it, the Senate restored funding for this project or that. It was restoring it from the House budget, which was absolutely horrible. The governor put forth back in January, February, I can't remember which, put forth a responsible, balanced budget that funded and met, not all the needs of the state because she was constrained a lot. But the budget that's going to pass is not near that, and so I think we have more work to do. So even though the legislature typically gets out of session on June 30th, I think we're going to be there a lot this summer. But it's important to keep engaged and push us and push the rest of the legislature in the right direction.
George?
He just took what I wanted to say, but yeah, I mean, we do need to be, engagement with your government is a participatory sport, if you will. And I really like the idea that you're here. Thank you for that. People on television as well, of course, but not only talk to your legislators, talk to your neighbors who live in other towns who have other legislators. Your neighbors can influence perhaps other legislators who are not hearing and need to hear how people feel about things. So get out there, make a difference.
All right, Richard?
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I think I'm speaking for all of us when I say that I and my colleagues really do appreciate hearing from you. I really like it when I hear from constituents about what they think and what they're interested in. So I encourage you to contact me and to contact the rest of us, and to follow George's advice to encourage your friends who live in other communities to let their legislators know what they think. Thank you.
And I would not hold my breath about the results of the budget, because we get paid $100 a year, and a lot of people are going on vacation during the summer, and we're not going to be voting during the summer. At least the House won't, because they can't get enough of us back. There's also no air conditioning in the voting hall. I am hoping we can get a continuing resolution passed. It takes 2/3. They're planning on doing a contingent resolution this week so that they will not have to try to call people back after the governor vetoes. But it takes 2/3 of both houses, so it's going to be a little bumpy.
Right. So I want to just follow up on the contact us. We here in Lebanon, I hear from very few people from Lebanon on issues. Occasionally we get a large campaign by a particular group, Move On or someone like that.
We're closing it.
But at the end of the day, we hear from very few individual Lebanon folks. I've heard from 2 folks on the budget from Lebanon, and that's it. One was about Medicaid expansion, and the other was some other portion of the budget, and I don't remember what it is. So please call us, write us, and it's great to hear emails that have a different subject line than the 3,000 we're getting from override the governor's veto on on House Bill 603 or whatever. So it's refreshing to hear from you all. The speaker did just distribute by email this evening a continuing resolution which would allow government to continue to operate for 6 months, 1/12 per month. But like Sue said, that's going to be a rocky road, and there's no guarantees that that's going to pass. But certainly I think it's important. And thank you all. And we're happy as we walk out to take your questions, but it sounds like we're being asked to leave. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.